Hello, this is Prof E Shapiro, and I am here to talk about the concept of what does law really mean. So what is the law? Do you have any ideas? Before you took this class or opened your textbook, what did you think? Now really pause, ask yourself, what did you think? So what was your concept of a law? You've never ever read anything about it, but your whole life, I'm sure that you had an idea of what law meant. So what was it? I bet a 2-year-old would have an idea of what law meant. So when I ask students this question, they say that they typically think of the following concepts before they've taken a class regarding law. Sometimes they say a guideline. A lot of students say a regulation or a rule. Some people say something important that people write down or something else. So let's compare those common concepts of what we typically think of as a law to technical definitions of law. Scholars' definition. Oliver Wendell Holmes was a scholar and U.S. Supreme Court Justice, and he said, "Law is a statement of the circumstances in which the public force is brought to bear through the courts." So this is one way of describing the law technically. Circumstances, force brought to bear. So there it's implying that it's something that's required, and if it's not followed, there's a consequence. So going back to the concepts that people usually think of, that means that a guideline would not be a law, because a guideline is a suggestion of recommended behavior, but it doesn't necessarily have a consequence. Now, rules can have consequences, maybe not always, but that does not necessarily make it a law. What if the rule was one that your mom made up? Is that really a law? It looks like here it's talking about the public force, not your mom. So public force would be required for something to be a law. What does public force mean? If you're in a democracy, that means it's the power of the people coming up through voting, coming up through laws created by people who they vote for, or by justices who are appointed by people for whom they vote, or perhaps people for whom they vote directly in some cases. And that could be one definition of public force, the force that comes up from the people. If you are in a country that is authoritarian or that has some other system other than power from the people, then that force would not be the public force specifically, it would be the governmental force. And even if a dictator says he represents the people and they love him, it's not really a public force in the same way. So let's look at another definition. Black's Law Dictionary, which is a dictionary of legal terms. It's not actually a source of law. You can't cite to it as binding authority in a court of law. You will see in this whole chapter that there are sources of law, but Black's Law Dictionary is not one of them. Nonetheless, it's a dictionary often used by law students and others, and it says, "Law in its generic sense is a body of rules of action or conduct prescribed by controlling authority and having binding legal force." This word binding means required. You are bound to it. You will see the word binding again in this course and in this chapter, specifically in this chapter when we talk about binding precedent, which is a kind of common law. So a body of rules of action. So there is rule in there, but it must be prescribed by a controlling authority. So that usually means, again, the same thing as before, that you are required and you are going to have to do it. And it's that which must be obeyed and followed by members of society, subject to sanctions, which is consequences, or, again, legal consequences. So any kind of sanctions or consequences. by members of society because it's in the public versus a private rule. A law is a public enforced rule. Later in the chapter, you're going to be looking at, okay, so now we know what a law is, but what are the sources of law? How do they show up? Where do I find them? And you're going to see that the sources of law include constitutional law, statutory law, which is both state and federal, regulations from regulatory agencies, and international law. And you will learn more about that as this chapter progresses. Thank you.